On the morning of her wedding, Ava was ready to leave when her cat suddenly stepped in front of her and wouldn't move. It seemed strange, too deliberate to ignore. What happened next led her down a path she never expected, uncovering something that turned her entire day and her understanding of the past upside down. Rain had been forecast, but the sky remained soft and blue, with sunlight sliding through the thin white curtains of the old house. Ava stood still in front of the mirror, barely blinking. Her fingers hovered above the edge of the vanity table, not quite touching the wooden surface. The wedding dress clung to her like a second skin, ivory lace, delicate patterns hand-stitched by her aunt who had passed away last winter. Everything was meant to feel perfect, yet something inside her remained quiet and distant. Her mother and sister had already rushed off to the church to help with final arrangements. The makeup artist had packed up. The hairstylist left her with a mirror full of pinned curls and sprayed waves. Ava had asked for a few moments alone, saying she just needed to breathe. Everyone thought it was nerves. But that wasn't the reason. Behind her, the room creaked softly as her cat, Miso, stepped through the doorway. She had been raised with this cat. Miso had been there through every rough night, every tear, every time someone left. The cat was old now, her white fur slightly grayed and her steps slower. Still, she followed Ava around like a shadow, like something tethered to her soul. As Ava turned slightly to reach for her earrings, Miso walked straight toward her and sat down in front of the door. She didn't meow, didn't stretch or lie down, she just stared at Ava with those still, knowing eyes. For a moment, Ava stared back, wondering why she felt like she was being watched with intention. Her phone buzzed against the edge of the table. A message from her cousin asking if she was on her way. Ava started to reply, but her hand paused. She looked up again. Miso hadn't moved. It was strange. The cat usually curled up in the window when left alone in the room. Sitting this way, so stiff and still, wasn't like her. The silence in the room felt thicker now. Outside, the birds chirped and a breeze rattled the leaves. But inside, Ava's chest grew tight. She stood slowly and moved toward the door, but the cat didn't budge. Even when she gently nudged her with her foot, Miso stood firm. Her eyes widened and she made a small, low sound, something between a meow and a groan. Not of pain, not of anger. Just something that seemed worried. That was the only word Ava could attach to it. The cat looked worried. It made her stop moving. She crouched down, the dress puffing around her like a heavy cloud, and reached out. Miso leaned forward and sniffed her hand, then turned her head toward the bed. She didn't look back at Ava. Just stared. Ava followed her gaze. Everything on the bed looked normal, the veil, the white clutch bag, the folded shawl in case the weather turned cold. But something didn't sit right. She stood up and walked toward the bed, brushing her hand across the shawl, lifting the bag, peeking beneath the veil. There was nothing unusual. She almost turned back to tell herself she was overthinking. But then, as she reached under the pillow, something she hadn't touched since morning, her fingers brushed against a flat object. It was tucked deep, not where anyone would have placed something accidentally. She pulled out a worn envelope. Her name was written across it in faded blue ink, barely legible. The handwriting wasn't familiar at first glance, but something about the slant triggered a memory. She sat down at the edge of the bed, eyes stuck on the envelope. Miso hopped up beside her, curling around her side but keeping her gaze on the letter, as if it mattered to her too. Ava hesitated before opening it. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a sense of crossing a line she didn't know existed until that moment. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. The ink was the same, blue, aged, and slightly smudged at the corners. The letter didn't begin with a name. There was no greeting. It started mid-thought, as if the person had poured something out in a rush, like they couldn't keep it in anymore. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, a chill passed through her. It mentioned her father. The same father she hadn't seen since she was 11. The man her mother said had walked out on them without a word. Ava had never asked too many questions. The few times she did, her mother shut down, telling her some doors were better left closed. The letter told a different story. A story where her father hadn't left by choice. A story filled with names she didn't recognize, places she'd never been, and decisions that were made behind her back. Someone had wanted him gone. And whoever wrote the letter claimed to know why. By the time she reached the end of the page, her throat felt dry. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked like a bride. She looked like someone who had just been dropped into someone else's life. She turned slowly to look at Miso again. The cat had curled into a ball now, resting, no longer alert. Whatever had been pushing her to act had passed. Or maybe her job was done. Ava placed the letter in her lap, her fingers still pressed to the paper, eyes focused on the door. The church could wait. The dress could wrinkle. The vows could be delayed. Something else needed to be understood first. Ava didn't leave the room. The silence around her had grown louder, settling in like an unwanted guest. The letter sat quietly in her lap, its presence heavier than its weight could explain. She hadn't moved since reading the last line. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there. Her phone buzzed again on the vanity table, but she ignored it. She kept reading the letter, scanning the same sentences again, hoping the meaning would shift or at least become clearer. But it didn't. It remained what it was, a message left behind by someone who had either vanished or been taken from her life on purpose. There were no clear instructions, just a confession. A scattered telling of truths never meant to reach her hands. Ava rose from the bed and placed the letter back inside the envelope. Her fingers pressed the flap down gently, then tucked it into the side pocket of her wedding clutch. Her mind had begun to trace questions back to childhood. The way her mother's voice tightened whenever her father's name came up. How they had suddenly moved cities without much explanation. And why, even as a child, she always felt there was more being hidden than being said. Miso had fallen asleep now, her breathing steady. The way she had acted moments ago felt distant already, like a dream slipping away. Ava bent down to brush a hand along her fur. She didn't expect any response, and none came. But the small act gave her something to hold onto. She moved toward the window and pushed the curtain aside. The view outside showed a small garden, a stone path, and in the distance, the black car meant to drive her to the church. No one was in it yet. No one had come knocking. That gave her time. Instead of heading toward the door, she opened the small drawer on her vanity. Inside were old photographs, some from college, some from birthdays, and one framed picture of her as a baby in her father's arms. It was the only photo her mother never removed, but she always brushed past it quickly when showing guests. Ava stared at it now with different eyes. There was a calmness in his expression she had never really studied. His arms wrapped around her like someone holding something fragile. She wondered if he ever meant to disappear. If he ever thought she'd grow up with questions and never hear answers. Downstairs, she heard footsteps. Slow ones. Someone must have come back to check on her. She tucked the picture into the bottom of the drawer and stepped out of the room. Her dress dragged slightly behind her as she moved down the stairs, her hand brushing the railing. Her sister stood in the front hallway holding a bouquet and looking confused. She said Ava needed to hurry, that the guests were arriving, that people were starting to talk. Ava nodded but said little. Her sister stepped forward to adjust her veil and noticed the look on Ava's face. She asked what was wrong, but Ava didn't give her an answer. She said only that she needed one more stop before the church. Something small. Something personal. At first, her sister objected. But the expression Ava wore didn't invite a fight. After a moment, she stepped aside and said she'd stall things if she had to. Ava gave a small nod, stepped outside, and climbed into the car waiting near the gate. The driver looked surprised when she asked him to change directions. She handed him a name and address from memory. It was a place she hadn't seen in years, but one that still burned in her thoughts whenever her father crossed her mind. The road twisted through old neighborhoods. Houses stood with flaking paint, gardens overgrown, and dogs barking behind wire fences. She kept her eyes on the streets as they passed. At one point, she saw a little girl holding a balloon, running after a cat that looked like Miso from behind. The car slowed in front of a rust-colored building. The windows were covered in plastic, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in months. Still, Ava got out. The driver asked if she was sure. She said nothing and walked toward the door. The place had belonged to a man who had once claimed to know her father. Her mother had forbidden her from visiting him, saying he was troubled and unstable. But now she needed to know if anything he once said had weight. She knocked. No one answered. She knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open an inch, not fully latched. Inside, dust floated in the air like fog. The living room smelled faintly of old paper and burned wood. A single bulb flickered weakly from the ceiling. A voice called from the back. Low, rough, but familiar. She stepped inside and let the door fall shut behind her. Her heels clicked across the wood as she followed the voice. An older man sat hunched at the kitchen table, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His hair was mostly gone, and what remained had turned white. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked tired. Like someone who had waited too long to speak. He said her name softly. Then, without any other greeting, he gestured to a chair across from him. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped in her lap. He looked at her for a long time, then at the wedding dress. There was something in his eyes that told her he had been expecting this day, or something close to it. He reached for a drawer beside him and pulled out another envelope. This one was thicker. The paper looked newer. He slid it across the table toward her. No words passed between them. She picked it up and held it close. He nodded once, then turned his gaze back to the cold coffee in front of him as if the conversation had already ended. Ava stepped out of the house clutching the second envelope, her hands tight around its edges. The wind had picked up slightly. It tugged at her veil and rustled the folds of her dress, but she didn't notice. Her mind had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that came after hearing something too heavy to hold all at once. The man hadn't spoken much after handing her the letter. His eyes stayed on the tabletop and she hadn't forced a single question. There had been nothing left to say. Whatever he had passed on was already waiting in her hands, written down, locked in ink and paper. She slid into the back seat of the car. The driver looked at her through the mirror, hesitating before asking if they were heading to the church now. Ava nodded once without looking up. The letter rested on her lap, unopened. She didn't know what would be worse, reading it and finding another painful truth, or not reading it at all. As the car pulled onto the main road, Ava leaned her head against the window. Trees passed in a blur. Her thoughts drifted back to the man at the table. He had aged beyond recognition, but his voice still carried something that reached into her memory. She remembered hearing it once at a family gathering years ago when she was too young to care about what the adults were saying. Her mother had pulled her away that day, whispering that certain people weren't meant to be around her. Now she was left wondering how many others had been pushed away to keep things buried. The church came into view. Its tall white walls stood out against the soft gray sky. Guests had gathered at the entrance, some holding umbrellas even though it hadn't started raining. The bells hadn't rung yet. That gave her a little more time. She asked the driver to wait. Clutching the envelope tightly, she stepped out of the car and circled to the side of the building. There was a small garden behind the chapel meant for photos and quiet moments. It was empty now. A narrow bench sat beneath a tree and Ava made her way to it without thinking. She lowered herself slowly, careful not to tear the dress. The envelope trembled slightly in her grip. She turned it over and looked for a name, a clue. There was nothing. Only a blank front, sealed with old tape. She peeled it open. Inside were folded pages, several of them. The handwriting was cleaner this time, more recent. The letter began with her name. There was no doubt now. Whoever wrote it had meant for her to receive it today. It started by describing a meeting. A night many years ago when her father had tried to return. According to the letter, he hadn't abandoned them willingly. He had been told to stay away. The writer claimed to be the one who passed that warning along. Her mother, it said, believed she was protecting Ava. She had been convinced that her father's presence would bring danger not from him but from others he had crossed. Names were listed, vague and unfamiliar. Mentions of debts, business partners, things Ava had never heard her father involved in. But the most painful part came near the end of the second page. It said her father had tried to write many times. He had left gifts at the doorstep. He had watched her from a distance at school recitals, staying in the back so she wouldn't see him. The letter included descriptions of things only someone who had been there could know. Ava paused at the third page. It was written in a shakier hand. It told of a final attempt, one she had no memory of. A day when he had come to the house, hoping to speak with her in person. He had waited outside until dusk. Her mother had called someone. The man who wrote the letter had been sent to turn him away one last time. Ava had been inside the whole time, upstairs, playing with her toys. She folded the letter slowly and pressed it against her chest. The ache that had begun in her stomach spread now to her throat. The past had changed shape completely and nothing she remembered felt safe anymore. A soft meow caught her attention. She looked up. Miso stood on the edge of the garden path, her fur slightly damp from the grass. Ava blinked. She hadn't brought the cat with her. She had left her curled on the bed. Miso walked forward slowly and jumped onto the bench beside her. She pressed her head against Ava's side and curled up just like she had that morning. There was no fear in her body, no confusion. Just a calm presence that reminded Ava of every quiet night they had spent together. Ava placed the letter back in its envelope and looked toward the trees. Her mind didn't feel clearer yet. In fact, it felt heavier than ever. But something about the way Miso found her made her feel less alone in it. From behind the church, she heard the bells begin to ring. They echoed across the yard and bounced between the trees. She stood up slowly, brushing the grass from her dress. The ceremony was waiting. She took one last breath before turning back toward the building. Her hand held the envelope tightly. Whatever came next would not begin with a vow, but with a choice. The ceremony had already begun by the time Ava stepped into the church. Soft music filled the space, accompanied by the quiet murmurs of guests shifting in their seats. The aisle was lined with white petals. A faint scent of lilies and polished wood floated in the air. Her sister caught sight of her from the front pew and stood quickly, relief washing over her face. The organist continued to play, unaware of the delay behind the heavy doors. A few guests turned their heads to glance back, curious, puzzled. Ava walked forward slowly, her steps quiet but steady. The veil had slipped slightly from her hair. She didn't stop to fix it. As she reached the start of the aisle, the priest raised his eyes, waiting. The groom stood at the altar, hands folded, face unreadable. He watched her approach, but there was something different in his gaze, less joy, more confusion. Ava didn't smile. She didn't pretend. She met his eyes for only a second, then lowered them to the floor as she passed the rows of familiar faces. Her mother sat near the front, dressed in deep blue, expression tight. Her jaw twitched slightly when their eyes met. Ava wondered if she knew. If the envelope she now carried tucked beneath her bouquet had anything to do with the pressure behind her mother's eyes. She took her place beside the groom. He whispered something under his breath. She didn't respond. The priest began to speak, voice gentle and practiced. His words drifted past her, almost without meaning. The ceremony continued as planned. Vows were recited, though hers were quieter. Rings exchanged, though her hands trembled faintly. Applause followed, but Ava heard none of it. After the final blessing, the guests stood. Cameras flashed. People clapped and smiled. The newlyweds turned and began their walk down the aisle together. His arm looped around hers, his fingers cool and steady. But she felt like she was walking alone, surrounded by a sea of faces she no longer trusted completely. Outside, the crowd followed them into the courtyard. A light breeze stirred the trees. Confetti was tossed into the air. Someone brought champagne. Ava smiled when she needed to. She posed for pictures when asked. But every movement felt practiced, disconnected. She caught herself glancing at Miso, who had settled near the church wall, still watching her with calm eyes. Later, when the guests headed toward the reception hall, Ava slipped away. She found a quiet room near the back of the church, away from the noise. The letter still rested inside her clutch, folded neatly, untouched since the garden bench. She sat down on a small wooden chair and stared at the bag resting on her lap. Her fingers traced the edges slowly. A quiet knock came at the door. She didn't answer right away. After a moment, the door creaked open. Her mother stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Ava didn't look up. Her mother stood near the window, hands folded in front of her. She said she was proud. She said the ceremony had been beautiful. Her voice didn't match the words. Ava pulled the envelope from her bag and placed it on the table beside her. Her mother's eyes followed the motion. The color in her face changed slightly. She asked what it was, though the question felt hollow. Ava didn't speak. She waited. The silence thickened. Her mother walked toward the table but didn't touch the envelope. Her eyes remained on it. Then she said something Ava hadn't expected. She said there had been reasons for the decisions she made. That the past was not so simple. Ava finally looked at her. She asked if it was true if her father had tried to return. If he had left notes. If he had ever stood outside their house waiting for her. Her mother didn't answer right away. She sat down across from Ava, looking suddenly older, as if years had caught up in just a few minutes. She nodded once. Slowly. Then she said she had only wanted to keep Ava safe. That her father had made enemies. That staying away had been the safest choice. Ava asked if that decision had really been hers to make. Her mother didn't respond. The silence between them stretched again. Then Ava stood and took the envelope, placing it back inside her bag. She said she needed to think. That she couldn't go back to the celebration just yet. Her mother nodded and rose to leave. Before stepping out, she paused. She turned slightly as if to say more, but then stopped herself and walked away. The door clicked shut behind her. Ava remained seated, staring at the empty space where her mother had just been. The noise of the reception grew louder outside, music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. But inside that room, everything remained still. Miso padded in quietly through the open window, jumping onto the bench beside her. Ava placed her hand on the cat's back and sat still, listening only to the soft rhythm of her own breath. The reception hall glowed with golden lights, soft music filling the air between conversations and laughter. Glasses clinked in a steady rhythm, and the scent of fresh flowers mixed with roasted vegetables and wine. The newlyweds were expected to make their entrance at any moment. But Ava wasn't there. She stood near the far side of the garden, away from the windows. The edges of her dress dragged across the grass, picking up small leaves and dust. The envelope had been returned to her clutch, unopened again since the quiet exchange with her mother. Miso walked ahead of her now, tail swaying gently as if guiding her somewhere only the cat understood. Ava didn't ask questions. She followed in silence. They reached the gate leading out to the back road behind the church. It was rarely used, slightly rusted, its hinges stiff when she pushed it open. The narrow road curved between tall hedges and led past old houses, most of them locked and unused. The cat moved with purpose, never rushing, never hesitating. They stopped at a small gate covered in ivy. Ava looked up at the building beyond it. A narrow house with a slanted roof and a single window glowing faintly behind sheer curtains. She hadn't been here since she was a child. She pushed the gate open and stepped onto the stone path. Her shoes tapped quietly against the cracked stones, worn smooth by time and weather. The front door had no bell, just an old brass knocker shaped like a bird. She raised her hand but didn't touch it. Before she could, the door opened. An elderly woman stood in the doorway. Her gray hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes were sharp despite the soft folds of age around them. She looked at Ava without surprise, as if she had expected this visit. She stepped aside without a word. Ava entered. The living room was small, lined with books and faded photographs. A kettle whistled gently in the corner. The old woman walked to the stove and poured hot water into 2 cups. She placed one on the table and motioned for Ava to sit. No names were exchanged. No greetings. The woman reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn box. She placed it on the table between them. Ava stared at it for a moment, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Some faded, others still sharp. Her father appeared in many, smiling, laughing, standing beside people she didn't know. Some were clearly taken in secret from a distance. One showed him sitting in a park, staring ahead, a shadow in his eyes. Another showed him outside what looked like her old school. The woman said little. She just sat across from Ava, sipping her tea slowly. Ava picked up a photo near the bottom. It showed her as a little girl standing beside her mother in front of a birthday cake. Her father stood in the background, barely visible, hidden behind a tree. She had no memory of that day. She would have never known he was there. Her throat tightened. She placed the photo down and reached into her clutch. She pulled out the envelope, the one she had brought from the man earlier that day. She placed it on the table and asked if the woman had seen it before. The woman nodded. She said she had helped write parts of it. Her hands weren't steady enough for long letters anymore, but she had told the man what to say. Ava asked if it was all true, if he had really come back again and again. The woman said he had. He had kept journals, drawings, even recordings. Most of it had been destroyed after his passing. But some things remained. She reached under the table and pulled out a small wooden box. It clicked open with a soft sound. Inside was a necklace. A simple one, silver, with a small charm shaped like a cat. Ava stared at it. The woman said he had picked it out for her when she turned 12. He had planned to leave it on the doorstep. But he hadn't. Something had stopped him that night. Ava touched the necklace gently. It was smooth, cold. She asked why no one had told her. Why her mother had kept everything buried. The woman didn't give an answer. She just said some people believe pain fades when it's hidden. Others think truth is too sharp to carry. Either way, Ava had grown up without the full story. The room fell into silence. The tea on the table had gone cold. The sky outside had darkened. The reception would be nearly over by now. Ava stood slowly. She placed the necklace in her bag and thanked the woman with a quiet nod. As she stepped toward the door, Miso rubbed against her leg, ready to follow again. The walk back to the church was slower. The streets were nearly empty. The wind had picked up, brushing loose petals along the sidewalks. Ava didn't feel angry anymore. Not yet at peace either. Just in between. Like someone who had stepped into a story that had been written for her long before she knew the pages existed. She reached the back of the church and stopped beneath the tall tree where she had read the letter earlier. Miso jumped up beside her, curling on the bench again. Ava sat down, pulled the necklace from her bag, and held it in her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat quietly, letting the weight of the charm settle into her palm as the evening closed in around them. The lights in the reception hall had dimmed and most of the guests had moved to the dance floor or gathered in small groups around the tables. Laughter echoed off the walls, soft music flowed between conversations, and waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of desserts. No one seemed to notice the bride was missing. Ava stood outside one of the side doors near the edge of the parking lot. Her hands were wrapped around the necklace, the charm resting against her palm. Miso was curled near her feet, eyes half closed, ears twitching slightly with every sound. The air had cooled and a faint breeze passed through the trees lining the road behind the church. She hadn't planned to leave again. But something about sitting in the garden holding the necklace had made her restless. The feeling grew slowly, rising with every second until she couldn't sit still anymore. The silence had become too loud, the unanswered questions too sharp. She climbed into one of the unused shuttle cars parked near the edge of the lot. The driver had been waiting to take guests back to nearby hotels. She gave him an address she hadn't spoken aloud in years. He glanced at her in the mirror but said nothing. The car pulled away, the tires crackling softly over gravel. The address belonged to a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood across the city. It had once belonged to her mother's younger sister. Ava hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. She had moved away suddenly after an argument no one ever fully explained. Her mother never spoke her name again, and Ava had learned not to ask. But now she wondered if that silence had been part of everything else. The apartment building hadn't changed much. A cracked walkway, rusted mailboxes, a light above the door that blinked every few seconds. Ava stepped out of the car, her dress bunched at her side to keep it from dragging. Miso followed close behind. She climbed the stairs slowly. Each step creaked beneath her weight. At the third floor, she paused in front of a green door with peeling paint. For a moment, she stood still, unsure what she would say. Then she raised her hand and knocked. The door opened a few seconds later. Her aunt looked almost exactly as Ava remembered, taller than her mother, with sharp features and short silver hair. Her eyes widened at the sight of the wedding dress, but she didn't speak. She stepped aside and Ava entered. The apartment smelled like dried flowers and books. A kettle whistled on the stove, just like in the last house. The woman turned it off and poured 2 cups, setting them on the small table near the window. Ava sat without speaking. She placed the necklace on the table. Her aunt stared at it for a long time before lifting her eyes. She asked if Ava knew everything now. Ava said she wasn't sure. Only parts. She pulled the letter from her bag and placed it beside the necklace. The woman nodded slowly. She said there had been a plan once. A plan to tell her the truth. But it had fallen apart when her father died. No one had the strength to finish it. Everyone blamed someone else, and eventually the truth got buried. Ava asked why she had disappeared. Her aunt said she couldn't stay after what happened. She had fought with Ava's mother. She had tried to argue that Ava deserved to know what really happened with her father. But her mother refused. Said the past didn't matter, that the man they lost wasn't someone worth remembering. The argument had lasted all night. The next morning, Ava's aunt packed her things and left. She hadn't returned since. Ava listened in silence. Her fingers tapped gently against the edge of her cup. The warmth of the tea didn't help much. Her thoughts felt cold, drifting between memories that no longer fit the same way. She asked if there were more letters. More stories. Her aunt stood and walked to a small cabinet near the corner. She opened the top drawer and pulled out a photo album. It looked new, barely used. Inside were photos her aunt had collected over the years. Pictures of Ava's father, notes scribbled on the backs, short messages written in his hand. He had sent them to her aunt, not knowing if they'd ever reach Ava. He had given up trying to reach his daughter directly. Her aunt had promised to save everything until the time was right. Ava flipped through the album slowly. There were moments of him she had never seen, laughing beside a dog, standing near a boat, cooking in a small kitchen. These weren't pictures of a man running from his family. They were pieces of someone who had never truly left. She closed the album gently and placed her hand over it. Her aunt watched her closely, saying nothing. There was nothing more to explain. Everything left was in Ava's hands now. She stood slowly. Her dress had wrinkled from the long day and her veil had come loose. She didn't bother fixing it. She said she should go. Her aunt nodded, walked her to the door, and placed the album gently in her arms. Outside, Miso waited patiently at the top of the stairs. Ava held the album close as she made her way down. The car was still there, lights glowing faintly in the dark. The driver opened the door as she approached. She didn't ask him to take her back to the reception. She gave him her home address instead. The car pulled away slowly, the city lights stretching across the road ahead. Ava leaned back against the seat, the album resting in her lap, the necklace tucked inside her bag. The day wasn't over yet, but she no longer felt like a bride. She felt like a daughter trying to reclaim something she had lost before she even knew it was missing. Ava entered the apartment just past midnight. The hall light flickered when she turned it on, casting long shadows on the floor. The wedding shoes slipped off her feet as she stepped inside, one after the other, and the door clicked shut behind her. Miso trotted in quietly and jumped onto the arm of the couch, curling into a familiar shape that blended with the dark fabric. The dress, though beautiful when the day began, now felt like it didn't belong to her. She walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, and slid it from her shoulders. It fell into a soft heap at her feet. She changed into an old sweater and loose pants, clothes that didn't weigh anything, didn't pull at her body like the dress had. Then she returned to the living room and sat on the floor, cross-legged, with the photo album between her knees. The room held the scent of the candles she had lit 2 days earlier. Wax and something floral. It was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional shifting of the cat. She opened the album again, not with the hesitation she had shown earlier, but with intention. She needed to absorb every detail now. Not just see, but understand. On the first page, her father was younger than she remembered. His smile wasn't posed. It stretched across his face without effort. There was one photo of him leaning against a blue car, sleeves rolled up, smudges of paint on his hands. On the back, her aunt had written a note. He had painted that car for Ava's 4th birthday. Her mother had returned it without a word. Another photo showed him holding a baby. Ava guessed it was her. There were no hints of time or place, only the way he looked at the child. That gaze said more than anything written. As she flipped the pages, she came across letters folded into the sleeves between photos. Short ones. Notes that said he had walked past her school. That he had watched her blow out candles through the window. That he had seen her win an award and had wanted to clap but stayed silent in the back. There were marks where tears had touched the paper. Ava ran her hand over one of the letters, then picked up the necklace and let the charm swing from her fingers. Her father had chosen a cat. Not a heart. Not a flower. A cat. She looked at Miso sleeping soundly on the couch and wondered if he had known about the kitten she had begged to keep. Her mother had said yes only after days of pleading. Maybe he had heard her ask. Maybe the charm had been his quiet way of being part of her world. A soft knock came at the door. She didn't move at first. It was late. Unexpected. But the knock came again, more hesitant this time. She rose slowly, placed the album on the coffee table, and walked barefoot across the room. Through the peephole, she saw her husband standing in the hallway, still in his suit. His tie was gone and his hair was slightly out of place. He held a jacket in one hand, his other hand resting on the doorframe. Ava opened the door but didn't step aside. They stood face to face in the dim hallway light. He asked if she was all right. Said no one had seen her after the reception started. Said he had waited, hoping she'd return, then figured she'd come home. His voice didn't carry anger, only concern. But his eyes searched hers for something he didn't understand yet. She told him she had found something that had changed the day for her. He asked what she meant. She stepped aside and let him in. He walked slowly through the apartment, unsure of what he was walking into. Then he saw the album. The photos still open. The letters spread out like pieces of a puzzle. Ava didn't explain right away. She let him take in the images, the handwriting, the folded pages. He sat down beside the coffee table and looked through each one without speaking. When he reached the photo of her father at the park, he paused, then looked up at her. She told him the story in fragments. The letter under the pillow. The visit to the old man. Her mother's silence. The stop at her aunt's apartment. She spoke plainly, her voice low and even. There were no tears, no raised words, only the facts of what she had learned. He listened. When she finished, he leaned back against the couch and looked at the ceiling. For a long while, neither of them said anything. She asked if he was upset that she had left. He said no. That he didn't know what to say, but he understood why she had to. Then he asked if she wanted to be alone. She said no, not tonight. They sat side by side on the floor. Miso stirred and jumped down to curl between them. The lamp near the kitchen cast a dim light that softened the edges of the room. Ava reached for the last photo in the album. It was a picture of her as a toddler, playing with blocks, with her father kneeling beside her. His face wasn't visible, but his hand rested gently on her back. It was enough. She closed the album and laid it flat on the table. Tonight had given her more than she could carry, but for now she had brought the pieces home. And that in itself was something she hadn't expected when the day began. Ava woke to the soft light of morning filtering through the living room window. She had fallen asleep on the couch, her body curled beneath an old throw blanket. The album still rested on the table, its cover closed, the necklace placed carefully on top. Miso sat perched on the windowsill, blinking slowly at the quiet street below. The apartment was still. Her husband had left sometime in the early hours after making sure she was all right. He had said little before going, only that he'd be nearby if she needed him. She had appreciated that, no pressure, no questions, just space. She sat up slowly, her joints stiff from the strange position she had slept in. For a while, she didn't move further. She just looked around, taking in the stillness, letting the weight of everything settle again in her chest. Her phone had several missed calls. Messages from friends, from guests, from her sister. She didn't answer any of them. Not yet. The world could wait a little longer. After a quick shower and a change into fresh clothes, she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The steam curled upward and the warmth in her hands was steadying. On the other side of the table, Miso leaped up and lay flat, paws tucked neatly beneath her body. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out the folded letter again. The one from the man she had visited on her wedding day. She hadn't read it since that first time in the garden. Now she laid it out and began again, her eyes tracing the same lines slowly. This time it didn't feel like a shock. It felt like a map, each word pointing to another version of her life she hadn't been told existed. Her father hadn't been perfect. The letter admitted that. He had made choices that placed people in danger, including himself. But he had never turned his back on her. Not really. He had stayed close even from a distance. That knowledge was painful and comforting all at once. As she turned the pages, another note fell from the envelope, one she hadn't noticed before. Smaller, written on yellowed paper. It had only a few lines. It said he had named her after a song. That he had sung it to her once when she was too young to remember. That he hoped one day when she heard it again, something in her would recognize it. She didn't know what song it was. The letter didn't say. But her heart felt suddenly quiet, as if some invisible thread had been pulled gently through time, touching something buried. She placed the note back in the envelope and stood. The album stayed on the table untouched for now. She picked up the necklace and placed it around her neck, letting the charm rest just above her collarbone. It was small, light, but it felt like an anchor. Later that day, she walked to her mother's house. The street was familiar. She had walked it many times, but never with so many questions in her chest. Her mother answered the door quickly. She had clearly been waiting. They sat in the living room without turning on the television or making tea. Ava placed the envelope on the table again, along with the album. Her mother didn't touch either. Ava spoke gently. She didn't accuse. She didn't raise her voice. She asked for honesty. Her mother sat very still. She looked tired. Not physically, but in a way that showed through her silence. Then, after a pause, she began to talk. Slowly at first, then with more clarity. She said she had been scared. That she hadn't trusted her husband's decisions. That she had believed keeping Ava away from him was a way of keeping her safe. There had been threats. There had been warnings. She didn't know how real they were, but they had seemed real at the time. She said she had told herself it was better not to confuse a child with half-truths and broken promises. Ava listened without interrupting. Her mother's words didn't excuse everything, but they explained it. There was regret in her voice, woven into each sentence. She hadn't expected her daughter to come back with letters and photos. She had hoped the past would stay buried. But now, with everything out in the open, she didn't resist anymore. They sat like that for a long time, not saying much more. Just two people finally beginning to understand the gap between them. When Ava left, the sky had darkened again. Evening crept in softly. She didn't feel lighter, but something inside her felt less tangled. Like the knot had started to loosen. She walked slowly back to her apartment, her fingers touching the charm at her neck, the song from the letter echoing somewhere just out of reach. Ava returned home to find the apartment dark except for the faint light above the stove. She didn't turn on anything else. She liked the way the shadows stretched along the walls, how the silence let her thoughts settle without being pushed away by noise. Miso greeted her with a slow blink from the couch, then stretched and climbed into her lap as soon as she sat down. Ava leaned back, letting her head rest against the cushion, the charm of the necklace cool against her skin. Everything from the past 2 days still felt strange, as if she had stepped through a door that had been locked her whole life. The air was different on this side. Heavier, but clearer. She opened her phone for the first time that evening and scrolled through the missed messages. There were pictures from the reception, short clips of people dancing, and smiling faces from a day she hadn't really shared with them. Her sister had sent a message too, just a few words saying she hoped Ava was okay and that she'd be there when she was ready to talk. Ava responded with a simple thank you. Nothing more. She turned off the screen and let the phone slide from her hand to the cushion. The apartment was still quiet. The ticking clock on the wall was the only thing that kept time moving forward. She stood and moved to the table where the album still lay. She opened it again, flipping through the pages more quickly now, not to study each photo, but to find something specific. Near the back, tucked into a clear sleeve, was a note she had skipped over before. The handwriting was different, rounder, less careful. It wasn't from her father. It was from her aunt. She had written it sometime after he died. It talked about a box that had been kept with a friend, someone who had lived above a record shop near the edge of town. The note was brief, but clear. If Ava ever wanted to find the rest of her father's letters, that was where they had gone. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, her bag, and placed Miso gently on the couch. The cat didn't follow this time. She simply settled into the blanket, her eyes half-lidded, content to wait. The city was quiet. The streets glowed under yellow lamps. The record shop was still there, though the windows were dusty and the signs faded. The door was locked, but there was a bell near the side entrance. A man answered after the third ring. He looked to be in his 70s, with gray stubble and thick glasses. When she told him her name, his face changed. Not with surprise, but recognition. He nodded slowly and motioned for her to come inside. The apartment above the shop was small and filled with the smell of old vinyl and something sweet baking in the oven. He didn't say much. Just walked to a shelf near the wall and pulled down a small metal box. He handed it to her without ceremony, saying he'd promised to give it to her if she ever came. Ava sat on a worn armchair and opened it. Inside were letters, 15 in total. Some folded, others sealed in envelopes. There was also a cassette tape with her father's handwriting scrawled across the label. It had a date. Just 1 month before he died. The man offered her a player. She placed the cassette in, pressed play, and waited. Her father's voice came through slowly, rough with static, but clear enough to know it was him. He spoke plainly. He didn't try to sound perfect. He just talked. About the places he had gone. The things he had seen. The regrets that stayed with him. He spoke about watching her grow up from a distance. About how much he had wanted to be there even when he couldn't. Then, near the end, he said he hoped she would find the tape one day. That she would hear it and know that he had loved her. Always. He didn't say goodbye. He just let the tape run out, his last words fading into soft crackles and silence. Ava didn't cry. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, the box beside her on the cushion. When she stood to leave, the man asked if she wanted to take anything else. She said no. Just the letters and the tape. Outside, the wind had picked up. It carried the scent of rain and old pavement. She walked home slowly, the weight of the box steady in her arms. Each step felt like part of something unfinished, something she was still learning to carry but no longer afraid to hold. The rain arrived just after Ava stepped inside. It wasn't heavy, just a soft drizzle tapping against the windows and rolling down the glass in thin streams. The apartment was dark again, except for the dim lamp in the corner. She didn't bother switching on anything else. The quiet felt right. She placed the box gently on the table beside the photo album and the necklace. Then she removed her coat and set it across the back of the chair. Miso stretched on the couch, then patted across the floor to rub against her leg. Ava crouched to pet her, fingers slow and thoughtful, her thoughts still lingering on the sound of her father's voice. She had listened to the entire tape twice on the way home. Not to find something new in it, but to keep the sound of it close. His voice wasn't how she remembered, not exactly, but it held a rhythm that felt familiar, like something buried in the back of her mind had stirred when she heard it. She sat on the floor again, the same place she had fallen asleep days earlier. The room hadn't changed, but everything inside her had. The version of herself who had woken up on the morning of her wedding felt far away now, like someone she had once known. The letters inside the box remained untouched for now. She didn't need to open them all tonight. There was no rush. They weren't going anywhere. They had waited this long, and they would still be there when she was ready. She leaned back against the couch and looked around the room. The charm around her neck rested gently against her collarbone. It no longer felt like a question. It felt like a thread connecting things that had been broken. Outside, the rain grew steadier. It wasn't harsh. Just enough to blur the glow of the streetlights and soften the edges of the world. Ava stood and opened the window slightly, letting the smell of wet pavement and leaves drift into the room. She made tea and sat quietly while the kettle hissed. The sound blended with the rain, the hush of it all wrapping around her like a blanket. She didn't think about the ceremony or the guests or the celebration she had walked away from. That felt like another life, one that had paused while something else more important came to the surface. She picked up the last photo in the album again. The one where her father was half hidden behind the tree watching her blow out candles. She stared at it a long time before placing it beside the cassette tape. Then she turned off the lamp, sat by the window, and listened. Miso joined her on the ledge, pressing her small body against Ava's side. They stayed like that for a long time. No talking. No music. Just rain, breath, and the slow unraveling of silence. The past hadn't changed, but it had finally revealed itself. And with it, Ava knew something else had shifted inside her. Not closure, something gentler. Like peace, only softer. She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come. But tonight belonged to the things that had waited in the dark and finally found their place in the light.